Hello, so this is Courtney Orr, and I'm going to start our presentation with talking about disciplinary literacy and my understanding of it, and then talk about my parts of the lesson plan, and then Courtney Cranford will come in and finish. So let's get started. So my understanding of disciplinary literacy. Disciplinary literacy is a deeper way of learning in which the students learn to excel in reading, writing, and communicating in a specific discipline. One of the first quotes we learned in disciplinary literacy was write like a, and it was followed with write like a historian, write like a scientist, write like a mathematician. That quote really helped for me to dive deeper into my understanding of disciplinary literacy as it shows that the students are learning to be experts in their field, in that specific discipline. It's different than content area literacy in the fact that it dives deeper than it. Content area literacy is a more general approach to things, so it looks the same in every discipline, while disciplinary literacy would look different in every discipline. So the reason disciplinary literacy looks different is it identifies specific tools that the expert use in the work of that discipline. So going back to it shows the students how to act as the professionals do for that specific content. And it's important because it allows students the advantage to look at these skills beyond an academic standpoint. I think that's so important as a lot of kids struggle a lot of times with motivation to do their work. They don't see any point besides, they just have to learn it because it's school. This kind of gives them the trial run to see what it would be like if they pursued a job in this discipline when they're older. And I think a lot of kids need that. So now I'm going to talk about how you would approach a text with reading with English because that's what our lesson is over. So when you approach a text, you're going to look for ways the characters, setting, and conflicts display the meaning of the story. This is a lot different than what you would do if you were looking at a math problem. You're not really worried about the characters or the conflict you're trying to solve, the problem itself, so you'd be looking for different aspects. The characters play a big part in the meaning, to be able to identify the characters and how they act, and the conflict, goes into them summarizing. Another big thing is they're going to find underlying messages involving the theme. So that could be reading between the lines, making assumptions, being just really observant, which kind of comes to our next point. So the read skeptically kind of goes more with nonfiction. So that's basically, you have to decide if that's a credible source or not, and observantly goes for both. You have to be very observant when you're reading in English because little things that may not seem important may be very important in the end. You also have to pay attention to no vocabulary. That's a huge one for reading with English because if the students don't understand the vocabulary they're reading, they're not going to understand the article. You can't expect to throw big words at them and then have a deep understanding of what the material is. They're going to be trying to figure out what the words mean. You have to use the reading to make connections. So in fiction and nonfiction, you can use the reading to make real world applications. You can find articles of things the students might have going on in their life. You can find their interests, different things like that. And then I saved the last one because that's what our lesson is over. Summarize events in fictional readings. You also summarize events in nonfictional, but like I said, we're focused more on fiction. So they need to be able to summarize what they've read, and be able to tell it back to someone. So communicating with ELA, I kind of did both the perspective of communicating with another student and them communicating with you as a teacher and you communicating back to them. So, you need to, as a teacher, communicate any new vocabulary that might be in the reading. It'd be great if you could do it beforehand, but even giving them highlighters in the middle of it and letting them highlight any words or questions they may have. You have to look at perspectives, so communicate different perspectives in the reading. So it could be different communication between characters and how that affects the reading. You have to look at specific details and be able to pick out what details are important. The overall meaning of the text is a big one, to be able to identify what's going on and let them know how they come about what's going on. Text structure is a big one, a lot of different things will be in different formats, so they need to be able to identify different text structures. And then you need to communicate real world applications. You need to be able to tie the readings back to them in a way. So, like I said, it could be through hobbies or something they'll experience or something in that field. So let's move on to the lesson. So our lesson details We're teaching a third grade class and we're teaching them an English lesson. And some of the main points are they'll be picking out key details and they'll be summarizing a text in the end. So the lesson objectives, I like to do I can statements. I think it's a good motivation for students to know that by the end, their goal is that they can do these things. So I can look for key details in a fictional text. I can identify the main theme of a fictional text, and I can summarize a fictional text. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about how we're going to model their learning. So there will be a lot of formative assessment. You'll see that kind of in the guided practice and the activities I'll show you in a minute. So we'll be monitoring during those. Their graphic organizer, we're going to do a few activities with that for them to add on, different things like that. But that'll help me to monitor and model how far they came in the lesson. And then the board activities, so we'll be writing on the board, different things like that. That's also another way I can model their learning to see where they're at. And then the summative assessment on the end. I feel like looking at their graphic organizer and looking at where they started with at the very beginning and seeing the summary they write in the end is a really good way to model what they've learned in the class. So let's start with the beginning of the lesson. So the first thing we'll start with is a class discussion. It'll just, I plan to sit the class down, crisscross applesauce, and us just discuss what we've already learned because this lesson is more about application of what you've learned. So we'll go over things that they learned in previous classes. So one thing they learned is how to pick out key details and what makes it a key detail in the writing. They've learned to highlight main characters already, describe the setting and conflicts. So we'll kind of go over things they've already learned. That way, it'll get them engaged in what they're going to do and it'll get them in the mindset to write. And then the middle of the lesson. So one thing, I'm really big on engagement and making it fun for the kids. So one thing I'm going to do, the losing of the glasses, the story that we're having them read is about Kevin, whose mother loses her glasses and he helps her solve the mystery of her glasses. And so one thing I would do was while we're discussing or like right after, I would misplace my reading glasses and ask the class if they have any pointers as to how they can help me find them. And once they've gave a few answers or something, I'll say, well, let's read this article and see if Kevin can help us. I heard he really liked to solve mysteries. So it's kind of that engagement into the reading and getting them exciting to read. And then I'm going to show you the story and introduce you to the graphic organizer in the next few PowerPoint slides. So this is the story. Like I said, it's about Kevin. I made sure it had little pictures. I know that pops for kids. So the middle of the lesson is when we're really going to start having that application. We're really going to start, doing the activities. So I'm going to have them read the article 3 times. I think that lines up with the close reading pretty well. And I feel like that's important for them to build a deep understanding of what they're reading. So the first little read is just going to be a skim. And so they're just going to skim through it and see what pops out to them and see what they notice about the paper. And I'm going to ask them, what's the first thing they saw? I'm sure most of it will be, pictures, but I'm going to ask what words they saw. And we're going to talk a little bit about context clues to see, if they can guess what it's going to be about a little bit. And I'm going to have highlighters on their desk. I skimmed through the article and made sure that most of the words in there would be words that the kids most likely already know. But I'm going to have highlighters on their desk of different colors so they can use like a yellow one to highlight new vocabulary words that we need to look up and go over as a class, or a pink one for questions they might have after they read. And they'll be doing that when we read it over as a class. So I will read it to them and let them follow along. And then their last read is their most observant read. And that's also when they'll get their graphic organizers. So they're going to read with an observant eye and they're going to be looking for things on this graphic organizer to write. So they'll start with looking for the main characters. They'll look about what they want, what was the problem, how did they solve it, and what was the end result. And while they're doing that, I'll be walking around, monitoring, looking for questions, making sure the kids are staying on track, different things like that. So now to our guided practice. While they're also doing that, while I'm walking around, I'm going to take some time to write on the board. So as you can see, each box is color coordinated. I did that on purpose. I'm going to have a purple marker, a green marker, a yellow marker, an orange marker, and a blue marker. And I'm going to do little squares on the board. So I'm going to start the class off, and ask them if they're feeling confident about their writing, different things like that. And I'll write one answer in each little box to kind of guide them along the way. And this kind of leads into their or their interactive activity, which kind of goes along with the guided practice. So the interactive activity, I'm going to pair the students up in twos with popsicle sticks. So I'll write their names on popsicle sticks and pair them up like that. And the students will take turns discussing what they wrote in their boxes and why. I think that's really important because each student is unique and they bring about a different perspective. So not only are they hearing, my perspective and what I thought was main ideas and key details, but they're getting to bounce ideas off of each other before they actually start writing. So I think that's a really big one. So they will go over each section on the organizer together and discuss their answers. And then once they are finished with that, and I feel like every group is done with that, we'll take turns finishing the boxes on the board. So like I said, going back to how the graphic organizer looks, we'll start with the purple box and each group will come up and write something, and once we fill the purple box with everything that they need, we'll go onto the green box and each group will come up and write something that they feel, it's a way to keep them involved and engaged and letting them have the responsibility of coming to write it on the board, and being able to express their ideas too, not just sitting there listening to me. So I think that's a really good interactive activity. So the next part will be, them writing and different things like that. So Courtney Cranford will come in and finish. Thank you.
Hello everyone, this is Courtney Cranford, and this is my part of the presentation that me and Courtney had to do. We both decided to give our opinion of what we think disciplinary literacy is. Understanding of disciplinary literacy. I think disciplinary literacy is ways of reading, writing, thinking, and doing at different knowledgeable levels. Disciplinary literacy works within the discipline. It also results in the mastery of core academic content with that specific discipline, such as math, science, reading. With disciplinary literacy, you have to, if you're reading within science, you have to read like a scientist, think like a scientist, speak like a scientist, use the correct terminology as scientists, even as mathematicians. In Courtney's oral presentation, she talked about reading and communicating within ELA. On my part, I'll be talking about writing within ELA. And each student needs to understand how to write within a specific discipline that they're doing at that time, even with the same as communicating and reading. Writing within English language arts help students practice thinking skills relevant to material, practice communication, integrate and analyze course content. They also learn basic strategies for comprehending of a text, such as asking questions, monitoring understanding, and summarizing. When a student learns how to do all this, I think it's easier for the teacher to know that they understand what is being read, they're comprehending it, especially when they are able to ask questions. And with the open inquiry, that from the 4 levels of inquiry, we chose the open inquiry because we will have, once students read the article that we had chose, the Solver, it was about Kevin who's helping his mom find her glasses that she lost. After reading it independently, and as well as reading it in the class together, we will have the students to partner up to come up with more questions and answers in order to help them write their summary. And these are just a few things that I want the students to think about as they're reading and coming up with new questions. I want them to think about who it was, like the main character, what happened, when it happened, where it happened, why it happened, and how it happened. I feel like that getting students to think about all of those will also help them during their summary. The lessons details. Just like Courtney Orr had said, we're going to be teaching a 3rd grade class English. And we also teaching them how to summarize a text. But before we go into the lesson, my portion of the lesson of what we need to, teaching them how to summarize, I got a short video. It's just kind of, giving them examples of how to summarize a text. So real quick, I'm going to show you this video.
Welcome. Today we are going to learn about summarizing. Summarizing is a strategy we can use to better understand a text, specifically fictional text, or a text that is imaginary or untrue. We can define the word summarize as using few words to describe the most important parts of a story. We will use the following key words to help us clearly write a summary. Somebody, who is the main character? Wanted, what did the main character want? But, what was the problem? So, how did the main character try to solve the problem? Then, what was the resolution of the story? We will first look at the movie Mulan. In this story,
I'm going to stop the video right there. In the video, when they go to the Mulan part, it's just really just giving them an example of a story and how to go in and summarize and pick out the main parts. So I stopped the video right there. You can always go back and watch the full video. But moving on to what is the purpose for summarizing? We always want students to understand why we having them to do a certain lesson. But the purpose for summarizing is to provide a quick overview of the material, shows the student have an understanding of the main points of the text. Teachers can also test the students' knowledge. This enables students to better understand what they have read. The summary story, the solver. This is a handout that each student will have of the story so that they can read it independently, and we can also read it as a class. As far as the independent practice, on the independent practice, students will begin writing a summary for the story independently using their graphic organizer and using the notes on the board, because in the guided practice and the model learning, we will be using this graphic organizer over here to kind of help students pick out the main points in the story to help them, summarize it. And as we doing this, I will be walking around the class, making sure that each student understanding what is going on in the story, making sure they have the main points correct. And as we doing the independent practice, I will remind students to refer back to their notes and back to their graphic organizer. So that way, to help them to summarize the story more easy when we picked out the main points. When we looked at our notes, that will help the students understand the main points of the story. So they will do this independent practice when they return back to their seats on their own. They would take their like I said, they would take their graphic organizer, and they will also use the notes on the board. And as they doing the independent practice at their seats by themselves, like I said, I will be walking around making sure each student staying on task or maybe have questions to ask about it. Okay, as far as the application, how using this help students in another situation or, a real life event. I feel like when we teach students how to pick out main points in whatever they're reading, it just don't have to be a short story, but whatever they're reading or even listening to, summary helps students throughout their academic career. It improves reading skills for everyday life. It helps with vocabulary and grammar skills that we use every day. It helps with communication skills as well. And it does. And I feel like when we go to different, when they going for interviews or anything like that, we need to know how to use the correct grammar and how to communicate. And then even with vocabulary, when we're reading, when we have an understanding of the words and the meaning of the words, it's easier to help summarize. Access learning. How would I access the learning of this lesson? I will spend a little time reviewing what we have done in the lesson already by asking questions to why summarizing is so important to them. And I will also refer back to each student's independent summary to make sure that each and everyone have a clear understanding of how to summarize a short story. So that's how I would access the students' learning, and I will give them an opportunity during that time to ask questions if they don't understand what's going on. And then we can go over it again. We can spend a little more time reviewing that. But this was my portion of the presentation. I hope you enjoyed. Thanks.